Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial, and today we've got a video on the Battleship Maine. This is the anniversary of Maine being sunk, the second time. We're going to talk about that, we're going to compare Maine to New Jersey, and we're going to see if what sunk Maine could have sunk New Jersey, all in this video. Maine was an armored cruiser, sometimes called a second-class battleship. I don't really subscribe to that. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. In the U.S. Navy, built in the 1880s and 1890s, and her sinking by causes that are still debated led to, in part, the Spanish-American War, which was part of the United States becoming an imperial power and a modern naval power. So whether Maine is a proto-battleship or not, she is still significant in the design and development of Battleship New Jersey. Maine is one of a couple of big gun capital ships named after that state. There was a pre-dreadnought battleship BB-11 named after her, shortly after she sank. And then there was a Montana-class battleship, which was going to be named Maine. So I know in the last year the Navy announced that they were going to name new submarines for the battleships Arizona and Oklahoma, which have been sunk during the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, and their names have not been authorized since. Well, renaming ships after Maine shows that there is a precedent for renaming modern ships after ships lost in disasters like that. So, first off, Maine was laid down in 1888, and she was launched in 1889, which is pretty common for ships of that period, pre-dreadnought type battleships. And then things become a little bit atypical, and from 1889 until 1895, she's under construction. It took 3 years to build Battleship New Jersey, and that's a little bit faster than normal, but took a full 7 years to build the significantly smaller USS Maine. Part of that was, this is a brand new concept, the brand new type of ship being built here in the United States. Virtually since the end of the Civil War, the U.S. Navy hadn't built new ships. We had a ton of 1860s era wooden sailing ships that were steam-powered and fired shell-firing rifled guns. And we had a fair number of ironclad monitors, which were great for coastal defense, to complement the long-range commerce-rating wooden-hauled vessels. So the Navy in the post-Civil War years basically didn't build anything until the 1880s when we started building modern steel-hulled cruisers, the so-called New Navy. And even with these early protected cruisers, we were not the most powerful Navy in the Americas, much less in the world. So the Navy looked at building armored cruisers and battleships for self-defense. And they came up with two designs. One would be Texas, which is a battleship which never received a hull number. I usually refer to her as BB-0. And she is a second-class battleship. She's only got two 12-inch guns. And then there was USS Maine, which is Armored Cruiser number 1 in the U.S. Navy numbering system. Although she is sometimes often also called a second-class battleship, like I said earlier, I don't subscribe to that. She is numbered as an armored cruiser. I consider her to be the first American armored cruiser. And in the 1880s, when she was designed, her design is very much in line with other armored cruiser designs. And I feel like the news, the yellow journalism that we'll get back to later in this video, called her a battleship often enough that has really stuck. And I do consider the armored cruisers, Maine, New York, Brooklyn, and the Big Ten, to all be big gun capital ships alongside the battleships, but I would not call Maine a battleship. So, Maine's operational career is very short. She serves in the North Atlantic 1895 when she's completed until 1898 when she is lost. During this time, the United States is comprised of 45 states with 3 other territories that will become states within a couple of decades, and a couple of early overseas possessions. That's going to expand here in 1898. But the United States is looking to expand beyond her continental borders. Spain is an old imperial power that is really weak at this point. And in Cuba, right on the United States' back door, the Cubans have been fighting for independence. And the Spanish have been trying to suppress that movement. And the United States has been getting more and more involved because there are a number of U.S. business interests there. So, the United States, in an early move of imperial expansion, sends the armored cruiser Maine to Havana Harbor to look after U.S. interests in the area. Meanwhile, yellow journalist press are publishing all sorts of not entirely factually accurate accounts of Spanish brutality in Cuba, and talking about how the United States needs to intercede. Anyway, within a couple of weeks of arriving in Havana, Maine explodes catastrophically and is a complete loss. This would be February 15th, 1898. All told, 261 out of 355 crew members are killed. Only 16 members of the crew are uninjured. Interestingly, the explosion happens at the forward half of the ship. Most of the ship's officers, including Captain Sigsbee, survive. Their quarters are at the stern of the ship. Very traditional in older ships for that to be the case. Not the case by the time New Jersey comes out. So the bulk of them, the officers who aren't on duty, survive the explosion, and the brunt of the casualties is borne by the enlisted men. There are 3 theories for what destroyed Maine. The one that I believe is least plausible is that the Spanish destroyed her using either a mine or a torpedo. This theory is that a mine is placed along the side of the ship or maybe underneath somehow, or that a torpedo is fired into the ship, and that explosion detonates the forward magazine and causes the loss of the vessel. There was no water column seen, which is common with an external explosion, and external explosions like that below the waterline rarely cause magazine explosions, which is what ultimately destroys the vessel. And usually an explosion like that in a harbor, you'd find a bunch of dead fish floating around. That was not the case in this investigation. And so I think that that's really the least plausible explanation. The next least plausible explanation is that it was sabotage. Whether the U.S. government launched some sort of false flag operation to destroy this obsolete vessel to start a war with Spain, or perhaps even yellow journalist William Randolph Hearst or Pulitzer himself paid somebody to blow up the Maine to start a big publicity event. And I think that that's fairly unlikely, but more likely than the Spanish trying to start the war. Anyway, the most plausible, arguably the only plausible explanation for the loss of the Maine was that it was an internal explosion. Coal bunkers were placed right next to ammunition magazines without any sort of cofferdam between them, so they shared a common bulkhead. So if there was a fire in a coal bunker, which is fairly common during this time period, particularly with the type of coal Maine was using, that fire could have heated up the bulkhead in between to become hot enough to detonate powder. And the powder could well have been stored in contact with that bulkhead, so it wouldn't have taken a terrible amount for a fire to set it off. Maine had been in harbor for a couple of weeks at this point, so they weren't using a lot of coal. So a fire could have smoldered in a coal bunker for a fairly long time. That sort of explosion is fairly consistent with what happened to the wreck, and so I don't think anybody disputes that it was a magazine explosion that ultimately destroyed the ship. The question is, was the magazine set off by X, Y, or Z? And really, the coal bunker fire is the only one I see as plausible. If you have some evidence or some feelings objecting to that, let us know in the comment section down below. I'd love to start a discussion on this. These are my opinions and not necessarily the opinions of the museum or even the Navy. This is still something that is inconclusive. And there have been a bunch of investigations into it. In 1898, there were 2 investigations, one by the U.S. Navy and one by the Spanish. The Spanish found that it was a coal bunker fire, although they didn't have full access to the wreck, obviously. The U.S. investigation, initially, they weren't going to investigate it too heavily. They were going to send junior officers down to look at it and not content experts. And in the end, they did find an officer, Captain Sampson, who would later command American forces, naval forces during the blockade of Cuba, who was a higher rank than Captain Sigsbee, so he could lead an investigation that could claim wrongdoing on Captain Sigsbee's part. That's not what happened, and it was a bunch of line officers from the Atlantic Fleet that did the investigation, not necessarily content experts. And they said that it was probably an external force. They didn't fix blame on anyone, but it was probably a mine or a torpedo that set off the powder. So Yellow Journalism was able to take that and run with it in the press, and within a couple of months, the U.S. declares war. And this is an interesting point for the false flag operation. If the U.S. was trying to start this war with Spain, and we had this investigation that says that it was probably an external force that destroyed the ship, why did we wait a couple of months to declare war? I don't think it was something that the government was trying to do. I think it was probably mishandled, but not maliciously. In 1911, the U.S. Navy had another investigation. And as part of this investigation, the newly independent Cuba wanted the harbor emptied. So the U.S. built a coffer dam around the wreck of the Maine, drained it so they could inspect the wreck better than the first investigation, and they had relatively inconclusive results. Could have been a coal fire, could have been a mine. But they were able to raise the ship. They cut holes in the bottom to shoot water through, to break the seal between the bottom of the ship and the mud. They built a wooden and concrete structure across the forward part of the ship. The bow is completely blown off and obliterated, nothing left of that. So basically the back half of the ship with this wooden and concrete bulkhead was able to be refloated. And interestingly, the steam-powered pumps that the ship was built with and had been sitting in the mud on the bottom for over a decade were able to be reactivated to help pump the ship dry. At the end of this investigation, the Navy sailed the ship, well, not under her own power, but with a tugboat, right out of Havana Harbor into the Caribbean. And they had a ceremony where they covered the deck in flowers. They raised an American flag on a jury-rigged flagstaff. They'd already cut away most of the superstructure by this point as part of the refloating process. And they fired a 21-gun salute. They played taps, and they opened the sea chest, allowing the ship to sink a second time. And that is what today is the anniversary of. March 16th, 1912, when Maine is sunk for the second time. As part of raising the ship, they were able to recover 68 of the previously unrecovered bodies. One was identified and repatriated to their hometown. The other bodies were not identified and were placed in Arlington National Cemetery alongside most of the other men from the Maine who went down. And by 1915, they had erected one of the Maine's masts as part of this this memorial, which you can still go and visit in Arlington National Cemetery. So, still hasn't been conclusively proven. In 1976, Admiral Hyman Rickover personally funds a reinvestigation into the case, and he has a number of very experienced engineers working for him, particularly nuclear engineers, and they look at it and they say, from the photos that we're able to examine, we're pretty sure that it's a coal fire explosion. And then more recently, in the 1990s, the National Geographic Society funded another look at this using digital computer mapping to see what the explosion looked like. And they were sort of split. Their team featured some older members who put more value on the photo evidence and some younger members who put more value on the computer evidence. Interestingly, they didn't consult the earlier Rickover investigation guys, who many of which were still alive, and some of the information they used was incorrect. During Maine's protracted construction, there were a number of changes that were made, and so they went from, I believe, the wrong blueprints when they were modeling this. And so they came back with a torn conclusion, but a lot of their evidence that it could have been a mine, such as the way that the seafloor under the ship was blown out as if something had exploded underneath of the vessel, is probably based on faulty information. And then a more recent television show, I can't remember if it was Discovery Channel or not, also did a investigation, and there's still not everybody agrees. I'm sure you'll see that when you check the comment section. Let's see. So, would what destroyed the Maine have destroyed New Jersey? No. New Jersey doesn't carry coal. She carries Bunker C fuel. And Bunker C fuel in its fuel tanks is very, very difficult to light on fire. You've got to heat it to about 160 degrees to get it to the point when you can actually spray it into a fire and expect it to catch. You stop seeing fuel fires destroying warships by the time we switch from coal to fuel. There are also cofferdams between the fuel tanks and the powder magazines. So a fire in a fuel tank is not going to light powder on the other side of a bulkhead off. New Jersey's powder is stored in aluminum canisters, and so something would have to heat up the bulkhead, then heat up that canister, then either detonate the powder bag inside or detonate the brass or aluminum shell casing that the powder is in inside, and that's all highly unlikely. That's assuming it's a coal fire explosion. Could you destroy the ship with a mine? No. No American battleship was ever sunk by a mine. New Jersey's got a torpedo defense along the side of the ship that's 22 feet deep and comprised of 5 layers of steel with fuel tanks in the sides of them. She is designed to withstand multiple underwater explosions. Maine was not. She has no sort of torpedo protection. Maine does have a partial double bottom. New Jersey has a nearly complete triple bottom. So no single mine could destroy this vessel. Could damage the vessel, sure. I don't believe a single mine could even cause an explosion which would reach a powder magazine. And if it did, the water would destroy the powder before the fire could set it off. Could the ship be destroyed by Saboteur? Again, there's no precedent with this with American battleships, although a Vietnamese Saboteur did sink an American escort carrier during the Vietnam War by placing a limpet mine on the side of the ship. That wouldn't work with the battleship for the same reason stated. Potentially someone inside the ship could destroy a sea chest opening in the hull, which could flood a compartment. Maine has 214 watertight compartments. Most of them probably weren't sealed because she was in port. Battleship New Jersey has roughly 1,100 watertight compartments, and so even if an engine room sea chest is blown up, that wouldn't be enough to flood the entire ship. And this ship has enough reserve of buoyancy. If it happened today with all the watertight doors open, maybe we would sink in the mud in Camden. But we could be salvaged. If Maine could be salvaged with her entire bow removed, we could certainly re-raise this ship. So otherwise, how does she compare to New Jersey? She is 324 feet long, so almost a third of the size of this ship. She's only 57 feet wide, so only half as wide, and she only draws 22 feet of water, where we draw up to about 38 feet. She has 8 boilers, which is the same number that New Jersey has. She only has 2 triple expansion engines, which if you want to see one of those, my favorite ships to check them out on are the cruiser Olympia across the river from us, very similar propulsion plant to Maine, and the most similar vessel to her left in the world. And the ships Jeremiah O'Brien and John W. Brown, which still operate their triple expansion engines to sail around. She had a speed of about 16.5 knots, which is painfully slow, exactly half of the speed of Battleship New Jersey, which is interesting because she displaced 6,700 tons to New Jersey's 57,000 tons. Her boilers created about 165 psi and a temperature of about 360 degrees. So our boilers are creating 600 psi at 850 degrees. For an armament, she had 4 10-inch guns in 2 twin turrets. And these guns were mounted in echelon. So one is mounted hanging off the starboard side of the ship, one is mounted hanging off the port side of the ship, and in theory, they can fire cross-deck, but you damage your own ship doing that. Even turning both to face in one direction causes enough weight that your ship starts to list. So a really terrible main battery arrangement. She was originally designed open-mounted 10-inch guns, and luckily they put them in armored turrets, but those armored turrets weren't particularly great. They only elevated to 15 degrees, so they didn't have a great range, which is fine because they didn't have great range-finding capability. Ships like this have a mast so that lookouts can spot where the fall of shot is. Battleship New Jersey's guns elevate to 45 degrees, which allows them to shoot at the maximum possible distance. And with our tall superstructure, we can spot that fall of shot, but we also have optical rangefinders and radar rangefinding that allows us to actually find the range to targets at those long ranges. Maine had 6 6-inch guns, and she had 7 6-pound guns. 6-pounders, 57 millimeter. So these are for driving off smaller vessels. She had 8 1-pounder or 37 millimeter guns, and 4 45 caliber Gatling guns for shooting up enemy personnel. She's got no anti-aircraft capability whatsoever, which is fine because aircraft haven't even taken off yet. She has 4 18-inch torpedoes, and she was originally designed to carry 2 torpedo boats, each with a 1-pounder gun and a 14-inch torpedo. But these torpedo boats, only one was built, and it ended up even slower than Maine, and so they were never carried. Her armored belt is 12 inches thick, which is comparable to New Jersey's belt, which is 12.1 inches thick. New Jersey's belt, however, is angled and is Class B armor, which is basically a stronger alloy. Maine had nickel steel, which was one of the earliest alloys, and it's a little bit more effective than mild steel. So if regular armor plate is a rating of about a 1, mild steel has a rating of about 0.4, and nickel steel has a rating of about 0.6. Then you get to Harvey steel or early Krupp armors, which have a rating of about 0.8 or 9, and then modern armor like this ship, which has a rating of 1 or 1.1. So our armor is, even though it's the same thickness and the same weight per square foot, is twice as effective. Which simply means we could stop any shell that Maine throws at us at almost any range. And Maine's armor couldn't even stop our 5-inch guns from punching through. So, in summation, Maine was very much a product of her time. In the 1880s, she was a semi-capable ship. By the 1890s, when she was completed, she was largely obsolete. She was among the first modern steel-hulled capital ships built by this Navy, and her loss caused the United States to step out onto the world stage, start taking overseas colonies, win a series of naval battles with Spain that then caused the government to authorize more battleships, gained Theodore Roosevelt popularity, but Teddy Roosevelt would authorize more big gun capital ships than any other president, although Woodrow Wilson and FDR are close seconds and thirds. And Roosevelt's building of these battleships and sending the Great White Fleet around the world causes the United States Navy to become a global power. And eventually, with the construction of ships like the Iowa-class battleships, and maybe more importantly the Essex-class aircraft carriers during World War II, the United States becomes the leading navy in the world, a position that she still holds to this day, although we're rapidly losing it. So, what destroyed the Maine? Let us know what you think in the comment section down below. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, as well as a number of other locations, including private donations like yours. If you're interested in supporting the museum, there's a link in the description that you can go to. Remember to earmark what you want your donation to go to: restoring the ship, replacing the teak deck, or supporting the YouTube channel. Money that you guys have donated to support the YouTube channel allowed us to go from making one video a week when we started this channel to being able to make it a larger part of our jobs and create 5 videos a week. And because we're creating all this content, remember to like, share, and subscribe so that you're notified when new stuff comes out. Thanks for watching.